Stephen, it is so nice of you to join us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, to begin, would you please introduce yourself and your organization and share a little bit about why you care about sustainability?
Sure. Stephen Rothstein, I'm managing director of the Ceres Accelerator. Ceres is a nonprofit, been around for almost 35 years. We have a few hundred employees, and our focus is that to look at climate risk as business risk. Fundamentally, we think that businesses, to think about not just the next quarter, but the next quarter century, have to think about sustainability because that's what their clients want, their investors want, what's happening in risk. And there's a more personal reason. My 11-month-old granddaughter, Macy, when I think about what the life is going to be like, in 2040, she's going to be going to college, maybe, if she decides to go to college. And what's the world going to be like? We've seen a lot of these UN projections. So it is important from a business perspective, but it's also important for our children and their children.
Did I hear you say you've been doing this for 35 years?
Ceres has been around for 35 years. I haven't been with Ceres for 35 years, but yes, we started, again, back then with this idea that climate risk was financial risk. People thought that was a crazy idea. But now people understand. I mean, I'll just give you an example. So, in the 1980s, according to the federal government, NOAA, our country had one storm that was $1 billion or more every 4 months. So 4 months. Last year, it was every 3 weeks. That I'll bet almost all your members, either they or folks that they know have been affected either by floods or fires or heat or storms or some kind of natural disaster. And those numbers are growing all the time, unfortunately. Last year was just recorded. There was the hottest year on record. We are literally running out of records to break. And there are transition risks of companies that are products and services that won't be around in 10 years and big opportunities. So it is an enormous time of change.
Indeed. So, based on your experience, and Ceres was one of the real pioneers, real leaders in the area of sustainability. So, thank you. So, what reporting frameworks do you think are important, and especially for those of us who work in the supply chain?
So great question. So fundamentally, we believe that you can't manage a problem if you can't measure a problem. So for any of your members, if they're looking at employees that show up or inventory, they need good information to run their business. Well, climate is a growing risk. We're hearing about that from employees, from customers, from regulators, from investors. So we need good, consistent information. So first is we are advocating for the Securities and Exchange Commission to finalize their rule that's for public companies. That for some of the smaller companies wouldn't be covered by that. There's also legislation in California that would cover thousands of companies, both public and private. And then for those of your members that operate internationally, there are a lot of international rules. I won't go through all the acronyms, but there's a lot of the rules. So we think that is a good thing. But more fundamentally, there's also a lot of voluntary systems even before these kick in. To give a context, if you just look at the Fortune 500, 92% of them, 92% publish a climate report, a sustainability report. Now, they're a little different, some of different formats. That's why we need to have this regulatory process. So we think just like any other area that's a big risk and a big opportunity. If someone said to the company, what are you doing to prepare for inflation or pandemic or something else? Those are big risks. And depending on what you're doing, maybe an opportunity. We think this is the same thing, an enormous risk. And that's why you need these government requirements because it assures consistency, but also voluntary by industry.
Thank you. And would you expand just a little bit on your comments relating to the trends that you're seeing?
Sure. So first is we're seeing the climate is a growing problem. I could give you lots of statistics about the number of storms, the number of floods and fires. Last year, for example, NOAA identified $160 billion of economic loss. A year ago, summer, 61,000 people died in Europe because of heat. Many people here in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, where up in the homes that were built up until the 1980s, half of them didn't have air conditioning. People died because of heat. So there's an enormous problem on climate, on physical risk, but there's also an enormous challenge on transition risk. Meaning, if you work for a company, let's say that maybe is a cleaning company that makes spark plugs, well, 10 years from now, they may not be in business because if the new car companies are selling all electric vehicles, so there are parts and components that won't be made anymore in 10 or 20 years. And there's also enormous growth that the world spends around $1.2 trillion on renewable and emerging technologies. It's projected that number is to grow to 4 trillion. So that's growth of new businesses and new offices and new technologies. So there are enormous challenges and enormous risks. And this is such a complicated issue that we can't say, oh, someone else is going to solve it or we'll let the government. It has to be both every sector and the government, so that your members are, because they're on the front lines of this, both in the real estate, and you just look at the real estate sector, for example, that represents an enormous amount of the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted in our nation, and how they operate, how they're cleaned, what they do will have an initial enormous impact on the future and on, going back to what I said earlier, my granddaughter's life.
So, what advice might you have for companies that are just getting started on their sustainability journey?
I guess three things. First is talk to people in your field, because there are some best practices. There's some leaders in your field, and understand what they're doing. Read other reports, looking at, and that ranges from both the products and services that you use to training your employees. So understand what are the best practices, and then come up with a plan. And you can't solve everything overnight, but we believe everyone should have a transition plan that says, okay, here's where we are now, and in 5 years, we want to have changed XYZ of our products. Or if you have a fleet, what about your vehicles for electric, or the purchasing or procurement or things like that? 5 years, we want to be here. 10 years, we want to be here. 15 years, we want to be there. I mean, we have to get to a place that by 2030, we've reduced emissions by 50%, by 2050 by 100%, or else the cataclysmic impacts will just grow exponentially. But again, it can't all be solved overnight. This is not inventing something new. Most ways to solve this have been used, but they need to get out there more. So learn from others, share from others in the field, talk to your both customers and your suppliers, so up and down the supply chain, and then put a plan together and say, okay, this year we're going to do this, next year we're going to do that, and engage your customers. Again, we found that 41% of young people have said that they would more likely work for a company if it was a sustainable company and had those values. So if you think about just recruitment, from an employee perspective, there are things you can do there. Another thing that a lot of people don't think about is your retirement plans. I'll bet most or all of your members, many have 401ks, other kinds of retirement programs. Do those retirement programs offer an option that if employees want to invest in more climate-oriented options, they could do that? So there's so much they can do, and there's a lot of great resources out there.
Thank you. And is it fair to say that oftentimes the first steps people take, the proverbial low-hanging fruit, are things that drive efficiencies, reduce waste, and save money?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the federal government came out with a report recently. It said through energy efficiency, they've saved billions of dollars. And there are many, many private sector examples. There is a group called the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council of private sector companies that look at procurement issues, and they do it, for sustainability, but they also do it to save money. So there are many, many examples like that. The federal government is looking at requiring climate disclosure for their largest suppliers. Again, both from a climate perspective, but also from a saving dollars. So there are a lot of these times that it can save money. Not everything. In a transition, sometimes there's a little bit of upfront cost, but absolutely. And a lot of these times, these things seem overwhelming. The old proverb or expression about, how do you eat an elephant? A big project, one bite at a time. So you think about this, you take one initiative and another, and stay focused on it. And we'll find that, again, employees who respond, for those of you that have investors, they clearly are doing this. There is more shareholder resolutions on sustainability than ever before. There is investors representing $50 trillion of assets under management have said that they want the companies they invest in to have net zero plans. So there is a real upside, not just on the products, but with your employees, your customers. I would just say, though, it's very important, and I'm not saying any of your members would do this, but to be very concrete. In other words, what people react negatively to is greenwashing, where you're saying more than what you're doing. So it's very important to talk about what you're doing, but to be able to back it up as well.
And last, actually, you've done such a great job. Do you have any additional thoughts that you'd just like to share with our listeners today?
That your members are critical of this. I mean, they're in real estate all over the place. They're on the front lines, and they can make, I would hate if they felt, oh, this isn't my problem. I don't control the big budget, or I don't whatever. They can make an enormous impact. And I would encourage them to think about, again, their own, whether it be their retirement fund or their purchasing, talk to their customers. Have they done a survey of their customers? Would their customers want this? I bet I know the answer, because it's very broad-based support, overwhelming time after time. On both, and this is nonpartisan. We just did a survey of a few thousand people, and on both sides of the aisle, we asked the question: do you think companies should try to be profitable and care about its community, care about the future, care about the climate, and literally over 90% on both sides. So there would be a lot of positive support, and I think that they will find that recognition as long as they do it in a very science-based, methodical way.
Well, thank you. It's certainly what we've been observing. And candidly, while not all of the customers of our industry care about sustainability, there's plenty who do. So being able to put together the plans and have the data and the things that you're suggesting certainly will give many of our members a competitive advantage in the marketplace, as well as helping them be more successful as companies themselves.
Right. It will give them a competitive advantage. Also, if they're recruiting new staff, it'll, for, again, particularly younger staff, that it does make a difference. And that, just as the awareness is a lot higher today than it was 5 years ago, imagine 5 years from now, the level of awareness. So if they've built a real track record, it will be even more of a competitive advantage, and it'll also protect them from the downside of what they're doing.
Stephen, thank you so much for being with us today. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you for the time and for the great work you're doing.